This is Scarehunter, and you're listening to Scarehunter Storytime. Many short, scary stories to chill your bones. Today's story is The Year Santa Claus Turned Bad. So turn off the lights, get cozy by the fire, and get ready for some scares. When you were a kid, I'm sure you couldn't wait for Christmas to begin. The decorating, the music, the food, and the most important thing of all, a visit from Santa Claus. Every kid had that dream of staying up on Christmas Eve and get a glimpse of old Saint Nick. But poor little Dolly's dream became a nightmare. It was on Christmas Eve, and it was your typical night for Dolly and her family. Cousins, aunts and uncles, and grandparents coming to visit, eating snacks, watching movies, and having fun. Later that night, everyone went to bed, but Dolly snuck out of her room to see Santa. She hid behind the couch so Santa couldn't see her. She was waiting for Santa and started to doze off. Dolly was almost asleep when she was startled awake by a small crashing sound. She peeked over the couch and saw Santa from the back. While Santa was putting presents under the tree, Dolly ran up to him and said, "Hi, Mr. Claus. I just wanted to make sure you know how good my siblings and cousins have been, and I hope they get what they asked for." Santa stood silent for a minute. Then he said, "That is very nice of you to tell me. But I must tell you that any kid who sees Santa—" As he turned to face her, he said in a devilish tone, "End up on the naughty list." When Dolly saw his face, she screamed. She saw that he had fire-red eyes, skin was frozen blue, his lips were chapped, and frostbite on his nose. He looked nothing like the Santa she read in books. As she stood frozen in fear, the Santa creature grabbed his bag and stuffed Dolly inside. Once he got to an icy cave, he put Dolly in an ice prison. When he locked her inside, she ran up to the door and asked, "Why are you doing this?" As she looked around, she saw frozen bodies chained to the walls, and she began to cry. While she continued to cry, the evil Santa looked at her and yelled, "Shut your mouth, will you? I can't stand kids who cry." When she stopped crying, he said, "That's better. I told those kids that trying to get a glimpse is like a curious cat. And you know what they say? Curiosity killed the cat. I told them no one can see Santa." As he gave Dolly a smile with his chapped lips, she looked at the victims more closely and noticed that their eyes were missing. She was about to cry again, but she didn't want to make Santa angrier, so she did her best to stifle it. Once Santa left, Dolly tried to see if there was any way for her to break out. She tried to break the bars that were made of ice, but they were much too thick. Then she tried to slip through the gaps between the bars, but the gap was too small. Each time she tried to squeeze between the bars, she would almost get stuck. So she gave up and sat on the icy ground as tears rolled down her cheeks. As she continued to cry silently, she heard someone hidden in the cell with her whisper, "Psst." Dolly turned around and whispered, and said, "Who's there?" When she said that, a little girl came out and waved at her. The little girl had red hair and ringlets, blue eyes, and wore a dress from the 1950s. Dolly dried her eyes and said, "Who are you?" The girl looked at her and said, "I'm Samantha, but you can call me Sam." "Who are you?" Dolly smiled and said, "I'm Dolly. Nice to meet you, Sam." Sam looked at Dolly's short blonde hair and pajamas and asked, "Why is your hair short? And why are you not wearing a nightgown?" Dolly looked at her in puzzlement. Dolly asked, "How long have you been here?" Sam shrugged and said, "I was brought here in 1955 on Christmas Eve." Dolly gasped and said, "That was 60 years ago. But why haven't you grown up?" Sam looked at her body and said, "Santa's magic, I guess." They heard the ice doors open and Santa came in. He laughed and said, "That's right. My magic keeps you young until I don't need you anymore and I kill you." When he left, the two girls tried to find a way out. As they continued to look, Sam grabbed a chunk of ice and said, "Maybe we can carve this into a key and pick open the lock." Dolly nodded and they got started. It took a few hours because they had to hide what they were doing from Santa when he would come into the room. But they finally got their key made. When they couldn't hear Santa, they used the key and unlocked the ice cell door. While they were looking for a way out, they heard someone screaming. They could also hear Santa laughing. Dolly and Sam moved closer to the noise, and they heard a child who yelled, "My eyes! My eyes!" As they continued to listen, Santa said, "That's what happens when you try to look at Santa." Then they heard water splashing, and they realized that Santa was pouring water on the kid and freezing him or her to death. While the splashing continued, the girls opened the door and snuck into the room and began to look for Santa's keys so they could lock him up. Once they found the keys, they ran back to the prison cell. Then they hid and as they hid, they waited for Santa. After an hour of hiding, they heard heavy footsteps, and they knew Santa was coming. Before he came in, the girls grabbed a huge chunk of ice and hid again. As Santa came in with the frozen body, he noticed the cell was open. He ran up to the cell and said, "How the hollyberries did they get out?" While he looked for the girls, Dolly and Sam snuck up behind him and knocked him out with the chunk of ice. Before he woke up, the girls dragged him to the cell. When Santa woke up, he heard a click sound as the girls locked the door. He ran to the door and screamed, "You two better let me out of here, or I will use my magic to destroy this whole place." Dolly and Sam laughed, and Dolly said, "Then why didn't you use it when we made that ice key? I mean, you know when we're asleep or awake, bad or good. And yet you didn't know we made a key and escaped. Some Santa!" They laughed and teased Santa by shaking his keys at him and stood where he couldn't reach. Santa got really angry and said, "If that's how it's going to be, so be it." He raised his arms and the whole place began to shake and tremble. As he laughed, the girls ran off. They found a way out, but they needed to get across a thin bridge of ice. The ice cave continued to tremble and shards of ice began to fall. Dolly and Sam were scared, but they slowly made their way across the bridge. They were halfway across when the ice broke and they slid down. As they slid, they broke through the cave wall and landed in a snowbank. Dolly was able to pull herself out. Once she got out, she went to find Sam. As she looked for Sam, she heard rustling in some bushes. Who's there? Dolly said. She saw a figure come out and realized that it was an old woman. Dolly looked at the woman and said, Sam, is that you? The woman looked at Dolly and said, Yes. Yes, Dolly, I'm Sam. Santa's magic wore off when we got out of the cave. Dolly hugged her and said, What will you do now? Sam shrugged and said, I'm not sure, but thanks to you, I'm free. I will never forget you, and thank you for everything. After they waved goodbye, they went their separate ways. As Dolly followed the hiking trail she found to a ranger station, she heard someone softly singing, You better watch out, you better not cry, better not pout, I'm telling you why. The song trailed off as the breeze blew. Hope you enjoyed the story. Unpleasant dreams.